Like to introduce myself. My name's Chris Catren, and how I got here, I spent about 30 years in the policing profession. I started as a crime analyst with no intentions of ever becoming a police officer. Decided to take that leap and had a great time. Became a police officer, got to kind of fulfill that dream. Worked all the way through the department. And for my last 5.5 years, starting in 2017, I was chief of police in a city called Redlands here in Southern California. Smaller by our standards, about 75,000 population, about 100 cops, and just had the fortune of having a great career, and I know that's not always what we hear, especially, in the realm of talking about behavioral health as it applies to first responders. But I was fortunate. I had a great career, of course, saw lots of terrible things, but we were fortunate. You'll see the little logos here with the Counseling Team International. We were fortunate to have culturally competent counseling available, crisis intervention debriefings all throughout my career. I was involved in an officer-involved shooting in 1999, fatal officer-involved shooting, and had counseling way back then. So I think that's partly why I was able to make it through the career the way I did, kind of unscathed. So how did I get here? So I was definitely no behavioral health expert, but as my career was winding down, literally the week before I was supposed to retire, I was invited to attend a tour at First Responder Wellness here in Newport Beach, California. And this is not a commercial. I'm not here to sell you on anything. This is just the program that I know, and I now work here. So there are others out there. So, this isn't the end all be all. We are great. I do want to put that out there. This is a great option, but we're going to talk a little bit about why I feel that way. So the week before I retire, I go on this tour of First Responder Wellness, which, so that you know, is an intensive inpatient, outpatient treatment center strictly for first responders. And I had no idea that anything like that was necessary. I didn't know that it existed. And then I didn't know it existed 60 miles down the freeway from me. So I got to talking to one of the people who owned the company, and I said, "Hey, this is a great resource. Everybody should know about this. Why is it that they don't?" And it was kind of funny because he said, "Well, you're retiring in a week. What do you want to do about it?" And if you know cops really well, which most of you probably do, we like a challenge. I had no concrete plans of what I was going to do after my policing career, but I knew I would do something. And so that turned into a job offer. And for the last almost now 2.5 years, this is what I've been doing, is really getting out there, trying to make sure everybody in police leadership, everybody that will listen to me knows that this level of care exists because it saves lives. So we're going to talk a little bit. I know you've heard some really impactful stories over the weekend or the week, about some of these situations. Excuse me. This is kind of, an option for when all the wheels fall off the bus for somebody. And hopefully long before that now, we're starting to see people take care of themselves a little bit better earlier. And that's what we want. So this is really about what does that inpatient treatment look like for first responders. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on why first responders need treatment, what keeps them from seeking help and all those things, because I know you've gotten a lot of that. I know with the group we have here today, you already know a lot of that. But we are going to talk about like what agencies can do ahead of time to make sure that this is an available system of support for their folks. What kind of facility should you send them to? What should you be looking for? We're going to talk specifically about our program to some degree. Again, not to sell you on our program because it is a resource. It's not something that we sell. We're a network with insurance, and we work with workers' comp. So it's not something that you got to put a line item in a budget for us anyway. But to tell you about our program, because it is somewhat unique, we are very well vetted by a lot of major organizations, and we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about things about, how do you know that this is actually worthwhile? Where you're sending your folks, how do you know it's actually working? How do you know it's worth it? All that kind of good stuff. And then how do you treat people when they come back from this kind of event? So I'm very, just very open to questions. So as you have questions, throw them in the chat. I'll try to get to those. Raise your hand or whatever, and we'll try and get to all that kind of stuff. So for us, when we talk about first responders, we're talking about pretty much everybody in public service who's putting themselves in harm's way, and experiencing traumatic events. So if you look at law enforcement, all levels, local, state, federal, and everybody in those organizations, because, if you're looking at crime scene technicians who may be civilian, you're looking now at even records clerks who are looking at body worn camera footage and videos and pictures that are being sent to the district attorney's office. They're all being exposed to trauma. Dispatchers who are often forgotten in this whole realm of policing and trauma, we don't forget about them. So dispatch, you look at fire service, local, state, and federal, and everybody in those organizations. We're looking at corrections, also forgotten often. Tough, tough jobs. Imagine everybody you go to work with every single day is a criminal, and just a very, very tough job. A lot of trauma involved in there. And we even will take, like district attorneys, who are doing, primarily the ones we get are the ones doing like gang and sex crimes. We get people from all the three-letter agencies from the federal government. So that's kind of who our population is and who we're trying to serve because it's different, right? I mean, the trauma that I experienced in these careers, as you all know and have talked about the last day and a half, it's very different than the general population. And so that's why it's a separate thing for us. Why are we focused on them? Because of that. These are people putting themselves in harm's way. A lot of the folks we get are also veterans, so they're military veterans. Why is that? A lot of times people become military veterans, they get out and then they want to continue service. So they become police officers, they become firefighters, they become dispatchers just to continue that line of service. But the traumas they experienced in the military, in childhood, a lot of times for a lot of us, and then in military life, and then in the first responder work, if it's not treated, if it's not dealt with, eventually something is going to break. And so that's why, we need this kind of level of resource for them down at the end. And so why do first responders need treatment? Like I said, we won't spend a lot of time on this. You all know this stuff, the impacts of the job, the high stress, particularly the hypervigilance, exposure to trauma. Then, of course, all the physical things, which then impact all of that as well with the high blood pressure, diabetes, the mental health impacts. And we see the whole gamut, right? Depression, anxiety, substance abuse, relational distress, everything, PTS, which is huge. Our program in particular, at the end of the day, is a trauma treatment program because you're not out there hiring drug addicts, you're not hiring alcoholics, you're not hiring people with all these addictive issues. What happens is the untreated trauma has to be dealt with somehow. So a lot of times first responders will adopt these negative coping mechanisms and they have to be dealt with. If you deal only with the symptoms, which are these negative coping mechanisms and not the underlying trauma, you're never really going to solve the problems for that person and they'll be back to the addictive behaviors sooner or later. So that's what we're talking about here, all these negative coping mechanisms, especially for policing. Alcohol is number one. Why? It's cheap, it's legal, and it works until it doesn't, right? It just keeps taking more and more. And then all the consequences start to follow with that. Sex, porn, infidelity, buying things, gambling, food, unlimited overtime is one nobody thinks about. But if you're always working, you're never letting that trauma that we've, so carefully boxed up and shoved down, you're not letting it up because you're always at work. And most first responders feel best when they're at work, they're engaged, you are hyper vigilant, so your body is just able to suppress all that stuff and not let it out, which is why a lot of times we see a lot of retirees come into treatment, right? Because you go home after retiring, everything gets quiet, and then boom, all this stuff starts to pop up out of nowhere, seemingly. You thought you made it through the finish line, everything is going to be good, and then all of a sudden these things start to pop up. So, and then we'll get retirees who say, hey, I'm unrecognizable from who I was a year ago. And this is why it's the trauma. So why do we not get treatment? I'm sure it's been discussed in here. The stigma is still there. It is still real. As far as we have come in the last decades, and especially the last few years, the stigma is still there. There are still people who just say, I don't want to look weak. I know it's going to prevent me from getting promoted. I know that my partners aren't going to trust me anymore. It's not confidential. All the stuff we all know about, it's all still there. It's all still real. These are statistics that are out there, pretty well known. 85% of first responders experience symptoms of mental health issues, right? So That's probably more like 115% of us are just better liars. Um, 50% are prevented from seeking treatment due to culture and the stigma of the job. And again, that's probably closer, much closer to 100%. Anybody that wants to reach out, a lot of people are prevented because they think of these things, the other things on here that it's going to make them look weak. It's going to prevent them from being considered for specialty assignments or promotion. All those same things, and we have twice the rate of alcoholism as the general population. So really terrible statistics, but I think we are making headway. I think the newer generations, your younger millennials especially, and your Gen Z, they have a different mindset when they're looking at mental health and behavioral health care. They're so much more open to it. I think we're going to change this. I think that's going to be the sea change as we look forward, and they're going to be much more open to getting help sooner and more often. So what are you looking for, as leaders in your organizations, peer supporters, clinicians? It's the hypervigilance, right? Everybody know that cop that's out there mowing their lawn on a Saturday with a gun on them. The people that are going to the grocery store armed with, one or two weapons. I mean, it's just like you get to this point where everything is a threat. You just can't get out of that stage, and so not hanging out with friends because those have consequences. You start getting so paranoid about just living life, you stop hanging out with people, you start to isolate. How many cops do you know, especially, and I've heard a lot of firefighters too that are just say, hey, when I'm done with this career, I am done peopling 100%. I just want to move on to a mountain in the middle of Montana and never see another human for the rest of my life. I mean, those are warning signs, right? And I think, I've been there, I'll tell you that. I've thought about that myself. It's like, I just want to be done with everybody and do that. And then I bring myself back to reality, right? You've got your family and you've got friends and all that kind of stuff. Not a great way to think, but it's a consequence of just having to deal with this negativity and everything that we're dealing with in these careers for so long. It gets to seem like that is a legitimate answer when in reality, of course, we know it's not probably the right thing to do, and it has long-term more negative consequences like suicide. So having trouble at home, I don't know how many of you personally or people in your agencies, people that you deal with are having real struggles, in their marriages and relationships. We see a lot of that. Like I said, we have the three different companies, so with the counseling team, that's the short-term counseling. And a lot of people start the counseling because of relationship problems at home, right? The spouse has finally said, hey, I've had enough. I'm going to leave if we don't do something. And that'll finally drag them and the first responder in to get treatment, in to get some help. Because the job takes a lot, right? As somebody was telling me the other day, it's like it just takes a bite out. And so, yeah, it's so many bites are all anybody can take. And so at some point that starts to really build. And, for first responders, a lot of times that looks like withdrawal. You just start to withdraw from the negativity. And then that's never a very good solution for fixing problems at home. I think a lot of us have probably seen that personally. So, intrusive thoughts. When we talk about our treatment center, most of the people who come have had these intrusive thoughts, right? Just these calls that won't go away. Some people describe it like the calls that the Velcro, they just stick to you. You can't wipe them off. You can't shower these things off. They just, whether it's the calls involving kids, domestic violence calls, something that is personal, like, you go to the baby death calls soon after you had a child, those things that just kind of stick and just keep coming back when you don't want them to. You can't, it's hard time controlling those thoughts. That's when, it might be time to start reaching out for some help or maybe a little pastime. And excessive drinking. And we all know those people, and it's just, I know, unfortunately, we know who they are in the organization. It's always like, oh, that's just how so and so is. Oh man, he'll really tie him on, or this is just how he decompresses after work. Not a really good, positive, healthy thing to be doing. So when we're talking about, you know, what are we going to do about some of these things? These are some of the first steps for getting help, right? And these are things that have been talked about this week. The peer support teams, chaplains, culturally competent clinicians, and I can't stress that enough, is getting the right people to talk to our folks. I talked to a firefighter who was in our treatment program, and he was telling me that, he was in an area that didn't really have culturally competent clinicians, so he was struggling, went to his city, and they said, "Hey, here's the EAP through our health provider. Go call one of these clinicians and see him." So he does that and gets a hold of a clinician who is not culturally competent. And he said in 5 minutes, the clinician was bawling, crying, and waving him off and saying, "Hey, you got to stop. You got to leave and don't come back." And so he's like, "Yeah, it was pretty crazy. I got fired from therapy." And so I started, chuckling. He's laughing. I'm laughing. I thought it was pretty funny. And then he says, "Yeah, it was funny until about the 50th time I was at home sitting in my closet with my gun in my mouth, pulling the trigger a little more every time. And then he's like, then a buddy told me about your program, and now I'm here, and this place saved my life." And so you just kind of like, wow, that's how bad it can go when you get somebody who really doesn't understand the rigors of first responder work trying to do clinician work in that realm. And the regular help, the weekly appointments, therapy, trauma work, substance use and abuse programs. And that's kind of what it's all about, is really starting to move in there. So when we're talking about um, beyond that, that's not going to work for everybody. These are the levels of care in general. So when you're looking at, this is kind of like the hospital language, or the insurance language, outpatient, intensive outpatient, partial hospitalization programs, residential and inpatient. And they're, from the bottom up, it's getting more and more intensive. And from an insurance perspective, it's getting more and more expensive, right? So when you're thinking about that and hearing these terms, that's kind of the order of operations, the order of magnitude that we're looking at. So, your outpatient is what we're trying to get people to do more often. Those are your 5,000-mile services, right? For your people, getting the regular culturally competent counseling, getting behavioral health training, a lot of stuff that's been discussed, right? Just the normal off-gassing of the really stressful things to keep the trauma from really sticking and causing you long-term problems. When it gets beyond that, a lot of places now are starting outpatient programs, whether it's online, whether it's, more of an in-person outpatient program. And then it just keeps moving up all the way to what we're really going to talk about today, which is, the more intensive residential and inpatient treatment. An inpatient is mainly like, hospitalization. And that's what we really want to avoid, is moving up that pyramid. So to get to those levels, the biggest thing is to have a plan, right? Because the one thing that I see in my job primarily is talking to chiefs, sheriffs, fire chiefs, HR, and risk managers, and making sure that when somebody raises their hand and says, "Hey, I'm struggling, I'm suicidal," or you get called out because that person has, gotten involved in an on-duty DUI, or they've gotten involved in a domestic violence, and maybe involving a firearm, their work firearm, for example, anything like that. Now this has ramped up um, beyond just the outpatient counseling, probably, right? Now we have a situation that's really got to be dealt with. And again, underlying all these problems is probably un trauma that has not been dealt with over a long career. So the idea is to prepare ahead. So I tell chiefs, what are you going to do when it's 2 o'clock on a Saturday morning? That's when this is going to happen. Nothing bad happens 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. When HR is on board, when the city managers are there, when all the resources are there, nothing ever seems to happen, right? It's always going to be in the middle of the night when nobody is around to answer a question. So you need to prepare ahead of time. You need to have policy. You need to have looked at where you would send somebody for this kind of help, when they reach out for it. You don't need to be investigating this stuff as you're experiencing it. You want to have all this stuff ahead of time. Go out and tour places. We have people tour weekly, almost every single week, if not twice a week, to come check it out and vet it. You have to put eyes on. You don't trust sending your first responder somewhere you haven't been to, right? Because you need to know with certainty you're sending them to the right place. So, we highly recommend that you do that. This is your open invitation to all come to our first responder wellness. You'll have my contact information at the end. We'd love to have you come out and tour. It takes half a day. It's in Newport Beach, California, right? So there's nothing wrong with a day in Newport, if nothing else. So making sure that you have a plan for before, during, and after this is key. And we will help you do that. That's not a cost or anything like that, but we have sample policies and everything else that we like to share that people have come up with because everything happens for the first time one time. But you shouldn't have every incident be like it's the first time, like you're reinventing the wheel every single time somebody reaches out for help. And we see that far too often. So it's better to plan this stuff out, have it all ready to go so that when somebody comes in, you know what to do. And it really makes a difference in how they view the agency, right? They figure like, wow, they have it together. Your unions, they look at you and say, wow, you really have it together. You do care about us. You do care about the employees. So this is what we're talking about before you go to treatment. Have that plan, have policy. Everybody's already created this stuff. You don't have to make it up. There are some very good examples out there. You've got your San Diego PDs and some of these big departments already have these things all worked out. They've used it many times and it just works, right? It doesn't have to be your policy, but it gives you a go by to say, hey, this is an example of how this might work in our agency. And this are a little bit different. So we're going to tweak it to kind of work for us, but this is a good go by. And to remove barriers, because what you don't want is for someone to raise their hand and say, you know what, maybe the world is just a better place when I'm not in it. And then for you to say, hey, you know what, why don't you go sit at home and think about that for a week while we figure out what the heck we're going to do? While we start removing barriers, while we figure out how we're going to pay you, while we figure out where you're going to go. That's the worst thing you can do, possibly, right? You've got to have this stuff lined up, know where you're going to send them, and get it done right now. And so you want to have all that done ahead of time so that you're not sending somebody at home to wait and possibly have a really negative outcome as a result. So when they go to treatment, what do you do? You know, the foundational elements for wellness in organizations for first responders, a great peer support team, and culturally competent clinicians, right? So the first one there is your peer support team. They are key. They're key to getting people into programs, and they're key for keeping communication with people typically while they're in there. Most of the people who come into our program have a peer supporter on consent. A lot fewer of them have the department on consent, but most of them do have their peer supporter on consent. So if you don't have a peer support team, create one. We can help you with that. We have great training. Definitely a fundamental component to having a good, well-running wellness program. Make sure that they're trained, make sure they've been out to these places, right? Any place you're considering sending your people, they need to go put eyes on it because when you have somebody struggling and you're having them contemplate going away from their family, from their job, taking this huge leap for, 30 to 90 plus days, the trust has to be there to where the peer supporter can say, you know what? Hey, Chris, calm down. I've been there. This is what it looks like. And in just a second, you're going to see what it looks like. But I've been there. This is what it looks like. This is how it runs, all that kind of stuff. That is key because you don't want to just be sending them, hey, hopefully it's good. We're going to roll the dice and see how it goes. That's not going to be good enough, right? How many cops are trusting of things they don't know about? None of us, right? I mean, and firefighters are not very different, right? We just don't trust things that we don't know. We all have a guy for everything. Is that true or false, right? Like you go to a cop or a firefighter, whatever the situation is, oh yeah, we got a guy. You need some plumbing done. Oh, done. I got a guy. You need a deck built on your house. I got a guy. We don't just shoot in the dark and go to Yelp or whatever. We have people for stuff. This has to be the same kind of way. So relying on your culturally competent clinicians, right? Because you're going to need to have them after the fact. Because the thing about going off to treatment like this is it's not a one and done type of thing. There's going to be ongoing things. And one of the things about a program like ours, for example, is you have an aftercare plan. And the biggest part of that aftercare plan is that you're connected with a culturally competent clinician that you're going to follow up with first 7 to 10 days after you leave here, but then ongoing after that for that maintenance, of your progress. You got to maintain that progress by continuing to see a good clinician. Knowing about the resources, like I said, visiting places, knowing where they are, who's running them, all that good stuff, and knowing how you're going to pay for it. Are people going to go on workers' comp? Are they going to go on their health insurance? Does the place you're going to send them, are they in network? So for us, we're in network with every major health insurer. So most of the people who come to us are coming in on their own health insurance, and they're only responsible for their co-payments, right? But then what are you going to do as an agency? Are you going to continue to make sure they get a paycheck? If they're not sitting on a bank of vacation time, are you going to put them on some kind of an admin leave or a critical incident leave or something like that so that they don't have to worry about getting a paycheck? Are you going to share that financial responsibility, for lack of a better term, with them so that you're taking this huge asset you have, putting an investment in them to go get better, and kind of sharing that responsibility a little bit? And that's obviously what I encourage chiefs and departments to do. Doesn't always work, but we're giving it a shot. So once they return, what do you do? A lot of people, anybody have ICACs, the Internet Crimes Against Children, any kind of system like that where people are working in just the worst situation, we get a lot of those people into our program, right? Because departments have this history of leaving people in those positions way too long. And then, of course, things go terribly, terribly wrong. And, we've had people come in after experience on all the terrible things, doing these child porn investigations for year after year after year. They finally break, they go to treatment, and we've had departments then guess what happens when they come back to work? They go right back to that assignment. I mean, it seems impossible, insane, but it's happened. So having a plan about how you're going to reintegrate people when they come back, what does it look like? Because everybody's going to be looking at that person and saying, I want to know how the agency is going to treat somebody who's reached out for help and gotten it. Because, hey, you've probably got 4 or 5 people way worse off than the person who went to treatment looking to see what happens with that person because they want to know if it's safe and smart for them to reach out for help too. So it's critically important to make sure you have a plan in place for what you do when they come back. Make sure your risk management HR are involved and they know the process. They know what you're going to do. Get them on your side so you're saying, hey, you know what? This is an asset for the city of whatever, and this asset needs some maintenance. We're going to send the asset to go get some maintenance. We're going to bring the asset back, and now it's going to be a better asset, and kind of getting them on board with that mindset because HR in a lot of cases the first knee jerk thing is boom, you got somebody with post traumatic stress, we're going to medically retire them. That's the way it's been in most agencies I'm aware of for a very long time. That's no longer needs to be the case. 94, this is the most important statistic I'll give you all day. 94% of the people who come to us who are working get treatment and go back to work. 94%. So when you talk about retention, like your best recruitment is a good retention program, right? And this is the best retention program there is. You take a good, motivated cop, firefighter, dispatcher, corrections officer, you name it, who is struggling, and you go send them away for 30 to 90 plus days, and you get that asset back way better than when you sent them, and you have a 94% chance of them coming back to work. That's an easy, if you want to play the numbers game, that is an easy numbers game to win every single time because it's so much more expensive to go find someone to replace them, train them, and get them up to that level of capability. And it's not like people are knocking our doors down to get these jobs anymore. So it's much, much better to just kind of to keep the people we have, not to mention the very basic fundamental fact we owe it to them, right? I know for policing and now most fire agencies, we had to have a baseline psychological level when we got the job, right? We had to prove that we were psychologically sound to become a police officer or a firefighter. And so if we are now less than that, whose responsibility is that? It's because of the trauma we experienced in the career. So it's the job, it's the agency's responsibility to bring us back if they can and get us back to another level. I mean, I just think we fundamentally owe that to the heroes out there doing these jobs day in and day out. That's what we owe them for sure. And their families. We always forget, these people are family people, and we owe it to them and their families to send them back, better. So in using your peer support clinicians, making sure that whatever organization you send people to will maintain a relationship with those people and have conversations, as long as they're on consent, because confidentiality is key, but as long as they're on consent, having those conversations so that when they come back, you have worked out a plan. Um, and continuing education to the department about behavioral health, about reaching out, about how to treat people. So all these factors just really make it a lot better to send people off and then expect them to come back and really, get back into it and really start to perform. So where should you send people? Like I said, this is not a sales pitch. We are first responder wellness. There are others. This is the one I'm familiar with. That's the one I'm going to talk about, right? So, but there are others, and I would encourage people to look at every one you can find. Um, so I'll talk about ours. What are we? This is a lot of words to say. Basically, we're a trauma treatment center. We do dual diagnosis. So if you come in with an addiction, come on in. If you come in just primary mental health, come on in because it really doesn't matter. At the end of the day, we're going to treat the trauma. And if, we're going to control the addiction, get that under control, then treat the trauma as the whole person. It's a long-term program. It needs to be that way so that, trauma treatment doesn't happen in, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, anything like that. It takes time. And it kind of goes from there. So how does it work? Residential detox, so that's where everybody comes in. You come in, a lot of people come in really in bad shape, alcoholics, really struggling and they have to detox. Sometimes people come in and it's just primary mental health, right? But they have to, their brains are on fire. So they have to calm down. And so that's the most intense level of care that we have. And so that is, hey, no phone for a week. We got to get you kind of centered and settled down. And then we go from there. So, but these are in residential houses, which I'll show you here in a little bit. And then you move through the rest of the process into partial hospitalization, intensive outpatient. The beauty is the client doesn't have to know anything about all of these terms. They just move through a program. We call it phase one and phase two, and we keep it that simple. So phase one, that's the residential detox. That's where it's 24-hour a day, 7 day a week care, nursing staff 24 hours a day. Um, you don't come and go freely. So if you want to go on a walk, one of our staff will go with you because this is basically in lieu of hospitalization. These are like insurance requirements. We know that first responders don't like that level of intervention in their lives for very long. So we try to keep that as short as possible. So that's sometimes as little as a couple days to maybe a few weeks, right? And then they move into phase two, which is a lot more like going off to college, where you're still living with us typically in our residential facilities. And then you're coming into our phase two facility for 6 hours a day, 6 days a week, getting all the therapies, getting your individual therapy, group therapy, and all the experiential stuff, which we'll go through here in a little bit. So when you're looking for a facility, whichever one it is, these are the things that I think are most important based on my experience here, based on what I've seen, and in the 2 months that I spent embedded in our program, to become more of an expert in this field and talking to the people who had taken that huge leap to come into treatment. Got to have culturally competent clinicians. So, like for our example, most of our clinicians are former cops, former firefighters. They're spouses of cops and firefighters. They are children of cops and firefighters, even some former spouses of cops and firefighters. So talk about a good perspective. So they all have a connection. And cultural competency isn't something somebody just admits to. Yes, I have cultural competency. For us, they have to prove it. So we have a rubric, we have a test. They have to pass this test. If they are 91 to 100, they're culturally competent and they can start working with our population. If they're 80 to 90, then they can go through some training, they can read some books, they can do some ride-alongs, and they can become and eventually prove to us they are culturally competent and work with our staff. If they're below 80, we invite them to be successful elsewhere, right? Because they haven't risen to the level to be able to work with our clientele. So it's something that people have to prove and not just say that they're culturally competent. Length of stay, like I said, we're a long-term program, 30-day minimum at least. And a lot of our clients stay 90 plus days. It just depends. It's very individualized to every single person. Every week, there's a clinical meeting where every person's case is discussed individually as to their progress and what needs to come next. Behind the scenes, we have a full-time staff member working with all the insurance stuff and all that stuff so the client doesn't have to deal with it. And as long as everybody's on consent, we're working with the agencies, we're working with peer support to kind of keep them apprised of the whole process and progress of everything going on. It's got to be trauma focused, right? Like I said, if you just treat an addiction and send them back, they're going to be back in a year or so, right? Because if you don't fix the trauma, the addiction is going to come back because that is just a negative coping mechanism to deal with the trauma that they haven't dealt with. So make sure that it's trauma focused and in first responders only. Why is that? Imagine if you've been a cop for, 15 years, you finally say you're going to go dry out and get treatment. So you dry out and then you go to group therapy and you're sitting there and there's a kid you arrested 3 times. And over here is a Newport Beach housewife who, you think you even saw her on the, Housewives of Newport Beach TV show. What do you have in common with those people? Nothing. You're not going to sit there and you're not going to have true conversations about what is bothering you. That it's the beheaded 3-year old I saw. You're not even going to bring these things up, right? So the thing is, when it's only first responders, they can say anything, right? Because we've all been there. We've all seen the same things. Because if you look from a 911 call through incarceration, that's our people, right? We've all seen and dealt with the same people. We've all been involved in the same situations. So we can sit there and have these conversations that we can't have with everybody else. So it's got to be first responder only, not a first responder track in a general population program. Ours is only first responders, right? And I would suggest you find a program that offers only first responders so we'll stay. Because the other thing is, if it's general population, people get out there, what happens typically is they'll pop out one of these general population groups and they leave right away. And then you have to have one focused on outcomes, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So we've already talked about this, who we are. So we were founded by Dr. Stephen Odom. We're Newport Beach. So far, we've worked with over 600 departments and provided services to over 1,800 public safety professionals. Um, we're FOP approved, and I think there's only 5 FOP approved facilities in the United States. So we're very proud of that. If you got to go to treatment for 30 to 90 days, it wouldn't be a bad place to go, right? So this is Newport Beach, California, not a horrible place to be. And why are we different? Like I said, exclusively first responders, the culturally competent staff, and our curriculum is designed specifically for public safety. One of the things I noticed coming here is that everything is intentional. And this was learned over several years, right? The programming is very intentional for the public safety population. They've kind of figured a lot of things out along the way, which has been great. We've kind of been through this. We treat post-traumatic stress, alcohol addiction, anxiety, depression, gambling, sex addiction, you name it. We do it, buying things, now there's the whole Amazon addiction. You name it, it's out there. We treat it. You don't have to have an alcohol or substance abuse diagnosis to get in, right? Because a lot of places have that, but we can do primary mental health as well. So you can have one, both, or either and still come into the program. So we're a long-term program. So I mentioned that, it's a little bit different than, the little rock star detox kind of thing. It does take some time because we got to treat the trauma. So most of our people are 60 to 90 days. The minimum is kind of moving a little bit because of some new treatments that are a little bit faster, but it's 30 to 45 days for the minimum. And we already talked about the 2 phases, the phase 1 and phase 2 a little bit. And here's kind of what it looks like. So phase 1 is the detox, like we discussed, stabilization for your mental health. It's 24/7 with licensed medical professionals. And we've got, the whole alphabet soup, whether it's RS, RN, BSNs, MDs, all the psychiatrists, everybody on board to do the services. And everything is on site. So all their therapy, everything is on site. If they have to go somewhere, we take them. The thing works out great. The one thing I want to get across, this is not some kind of a hospital facility. These pictures are actually one of our phase 1 houses. It is made to be a very comfortable, residential, relaxing spot. These are really beautiful homes in Huntington Beach, California, and Fountain Valley, California, which are great neighborhoods. Very relaxing because we know that a lot, it's very stressful to go through this. And so we want people to be relaxed. And we know that if you roll a cop or a firefighter up into a situation and you say, hey, give me your belt, give me your shoelaces, put on this gown, and it looks like a hospital, who's going to stay? Nobody, right? So ours is not like that. We know the population we're dealing with. They're professionals, they're serious, they want to get well, and so we treat them that way. And so this is kind of, this is how we operationalize that, right? We put them in very beautiful places, give them all the resources that they need to really relax and get well. So this is our phase two location. This is in Newport Beach. In phase two, that's where the real trauma works. So, once somebody comes from up here where they come in with the addiction or their brain is on fire, we get them calmed down during phase one. Phase two is where the real work on trauma comes in. And again, the alphabet soup comes out: EMDR, CBT, DBT, ART, neurofeedback, mindfulness, all this stuff. Everything happens. I tried a bunch of this stuff because I thought, this is all just woo-woo BS. That's what you get after 30 years in a career in law enforcement, right? You're skeptical about everything. And I was blown away. I tried sound bowls. Okay. I'm going to admit to this whole group of, all hundreds of you, whatever it is. I did sound bowls and I thought this is the dumbest thing I've ever done in my life until I did it. It was the most amazing thing I've ever done. It's so relaxing. I've never been relaxed like that in my entire life. These things are all there, and it's very, like I said, very intentional to kind of get your brain to settle down so you can actually do the work on trauma, because you can't work on trauma when your brain is going 1,000 miles an hour. So we have a bunch of different ways to get that to happen. And it's really, really impressive because every single person I talked to in the 2 months that I was embedded in our program told me this place saved their life, saved their career, saved their marriage, saved their relationship with their kids, or any combination or all of those things. And that's what sold me, right? I mean, that's why I'm here. That's my new purpose in life. When you lose a really purpose-driven career like policing, you want to have a good purpose. And that's why I'm here. It really fulfills that purpose to get the word out that there is help out there for everybody. Um, like I said earlier, it kind of mirrors real life. A lot of people say they stay around this long because it's hard to believe first responders would stay in a program as long as this. But they say, it's like being away at training because they live in our residential houses and they come to training 6 hours a day, 6 days a week. And then that starts to ramp down as they move through those different levels throughout the program. Here's some phase two housing pictures. Of course, it's a bunch of cops and firefighters, got to have a gym. We do equine therapy, and I saw that was on day one yesterday, which, equine therapy is unreal. That was another one that I kind of rolled my eyes at. I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. Absolutely unreal. Very, very cool. I've now been to equine therapy probably close to a dozen times, and it is unbelievably impactful every single time. It's awesome. Um, the family program, this is one of the things that really sets a program apart because the first responder doesn't operate independently, right? We're all part of a family unit, almost all of us, right? Hopefully. And so, if you bring the first responder from down here and bring their capability up here through, 30 to 90 days of treatment, and they go back home to the family, one of two things is going to happen. The family's miraculously going to come up here and meet them, or the first responder is going to come back down here. And so our idea is, hey, we're going to have a family program to bring their capabilities up here. So we invite the families out here to Newport Beach. We go through a 3-day intensive program with them: therapy, education, communication. They get a taste of everything that first responder went through for the last few months. And it really is impactful. We hook them up with culturally competent clinicians in their area so they can start doing work on their stuff as well. And the whole idea is to bring the family's capability and get everybody raised up. And it works out great. We get a lot of great feedback. Families love it. Huge, huge separator for our program. The admissions process couldn't be any easier. You start with the 30 to 45-minute phone assessment, see if this is even applicable. If it's not, we'll find a different resource for you, right? Because this isn't for everybody. It's not for who wants it. It's not for who needs it. It's for who's willing to do the work. So we talk to them about, we can take their insurance and find out what the co-payments would be. If they're coming in on workers' comp, we get that all squared away. We've done this, like I said, over 1,800 times. None of it's rocket science. It all starts with a phone call. Just never hesitate to make that phone call, and we'll figure out everything from there. We're right across the street from the Orange County Airport, also near Long Beach and LAX airports. So we have a lot of people fly in. We do door to door. We pick them up at the airport very confidentially and get them in here. So, like I said, we've done this 1,800 plus times. We're very good at it, to be quite honest. It works. We get them in and we get them help. So I'm going to zip through these pretty quick. I'm going to kind of skip this video for time's sake. We have a website with a bunch of our videos on it, and I can direct you to those. But just in the last 12 months, over 312 admissions, about two-thirds from California. This doesn't work the first time for everybody. So we've had 12 alumni readmissions, and most of those people, like if well, all of them will tell you they probably never started their aftercare program or they didn't continue their aftercare program because this isn't something that, like I said, it's not one and done. There's continued work that has to happen for this to stick. So usually 56 to 80 in the program any given day, and 71 days is our average length of stay. I'm going to zip through some of these. The big thing is whatever program you're sending people to, you have to make sure they can prove that they are, collecting information, they're collecting data, and it's a data-driven program, right? That they have evidence that their program is working. And that's what these next few charts show. We show like a major decline in PTSD symptoms. Our client feedback is crazy good. 75% and actually 89% are very likely or somewhat likely to recommend us. And that even includes the people who don't make it through the program, right? I mean, most of them are still going to recommend us. Um, what happens after discharge? We talked a lot about this, so I won't go through it all, but the big thing is connecting them to a culturally competent clinician when they're done, hooking them up with other resources like neurofeedback, ART, whatever they're going to do after. We have an alumni app that they can do and connect with other alumni through the program. Most of our alumni stay connected with the people they went through the program with. And that's what I've got for you. So it is a great program. Again, this is one of several. So the big thing that I want you to take away is investigate these things. Make sure that whatever you're going to send your folks to, please take a look at them and make sure that you have done your homework before you send somebody off somewhere that you're unaware of. So I'd like to answer any questions I can if you have any.
Chris, you do have a couple of questions inside of the chat. So
Okay.
what I'm going to ask is, would you mind just spending some time responding to that and like you could type to them and just enter it that way? Because I want to make sure that guys have enough time for lunch.
Yep.
And we only have 2 minutes before lunch. So um, I think that those might require a little bit more time than 2 minutes if you were going to
Okay.
respond. So if you could do that as well as anything in the chat, I don't see a lot of heavy things in the chat. I really love how descriptive you were in talking about all of the key aspects of the program. As you know, I've been out to your program to take a look at it before. That's where we met. I
Yep.
liked the housing. It looked like places that I would stay in if I were to come. They were in nice neighborhoods. I thought that the staff seemed really, normal, which is nice. Normal is a good thing. Like, nobody was, sticking out as being, you know, outlandish in any way.
Yeah.
And the clientele themselves were just people who were everyday people just trying to get back on track.
Yep.
So I liked the phase two treatment facility as well. I thought that that was a nice setting, and the proof is in the pudding. I think that you're going to have some people that will come that will love it. Some people that might come that may not get anything that they wanted out of it.
Yeah.
But I like what you said is key importance. It doesn't matter where you get help, so long as you get help.
Exactly.
You are providing an avenue for one menu, for one item on a menu, and at least there are multiple menus or multiple items on a menu, right?
Absolutely. That's the key is just people reaching out and finding a resource. We just got
Yeah,
to, the fact that more first responders die by suicide, that's the thing we have to stop.
that's
So
exactly
whatever
right.
avenue they get the help, they get the help. Absolutely.
Absolutely.